We believe that that is the foundation to build that future of 2050 I was talking about, right? You have to lay that foundation of optic fiber on land, in the ocean, build towers, basically, build satellite networks, constellations. I mean, this is what we need to do if we want this future that is the quantum future that we want, right? You have to start with that digital infrastructure. You cannot use the laws we wrote, right? I pioneered, I championed, right? Together with a team of industry and public sector people to write those laws we wrote, right, are moribund and old. They need to be shredded, put in a dustbin, and new laws to be written. Very soon, by 2040, we will have 2 billion people in the continent. 2 billion people. Think about 2 billion mobile phones that need to connect those people.
Hello and welcome to ITWeb TV with me, Sibahle Malinga. Today I'm joined in studio by renowned entrepreneur, Mr. Andile Ngcaba. He is the executive chairman and is the founding partner of Convergence Partners. He's also the founder of Solcon Capital. He serves on the investment committee of the funds under management, and he also serves on the boards of a number of companies in the Convergence Partner and Solcon portfolio, focusing on particularly strategy and technology issues. Now, Andile is a technologist and he's been actively involved in ICT public policy development nationally, throughout the continent and even globally for over 40 years. He's the chairperson of Digital Council Africa. Mr. Ngcaba, thank you so much for joining us in studio. It is an absolute pleasure and it's an honor that I don't take lightly to have you this afternoon.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Perhaps a good place to start would be getting an understanding of your childhood career. I understand that back when you were young, really your interest in technology dates back to your childhood when you accommodated your father to his workplace, and that there was the post office back then.
Yeah.
And he was actually working for the post office for more than 4 decades.
Yep.
And
so...
Yeah, that's the experience that shaped your career in ICT. Tell us more about that.
Thank you for inviting me, by the way, early 2025, and wish you a great year.
Thank you
just
so
everybody
much.
here in this ITWeb family. And you guys, I've seen you growing from, a small business, and now you are a very big platform covering all aspects of media.
Yeah.
But just to go back, firstly, if you take the post office, just to give context to this, the post office was basically a combination of what we know as telecom today and the post office. It was one, remember? Mm. And the post office is a very old institution. Just to go back, there's a law called the Post Office Act, right, and of 1958. And then there are previous laws, basically, of there's the Radio Act of 1952. There's also more laws of the 30s or so. Take, for instance, SAPC, where you were once part of SAPC law started in 1936, which is the SAPC Act. So before, remember, the post office and telecom as we know it today, they were combined. So you would go to the post office if you want to apply for a telephone, right? And apply, and then for the telephone to be installed, right? You go to the post office, you pay for a radio license, a television license. Oh. That's where all of these things come from. So if you are a postmaster in a post office, you would therefore be responsible for both the telecom side, right, and also the postal side, the telegram, the telex, and all of those things. So, my father in his career, he probably spent most of his life in the post office, having studied in the ranks, but ultimately became a postmaster in a number of post offices in the Eastern Cape, in Queenstown, in King Williamstown, in East London, in Umtata, in Uitenhage, in PE. So a number of post offices in that region.
Wow. So we've really come a long way since even the post office itself, when you talk about your early memory of the post office, look at what a drastic transition the entity itself has gone through. And now we're hearing the minister talking about, digitizing the post office. We're seeing the laws being amended. There's a lot of changes there, but we are going to touch a lot about it when we talk about ICT policy development in South Africa. Well, it's actually not much of a surprise then to hear that you were actually the first Director General of the Communications Department in the first democratically elected
and the Postmaster General, the first that was the first Postmaster General in '94.
That must have brought back a lot of sentimental memories for you then, coming back to that role that your father once took. Yeah. So how would you say the technology landscape in South Africa, particularly within the South African government, has actually evolved since then?
Look, I mean, the way in which I define the South African landscape is probably in three parts. I mean, of course, there's the pre-94 part, right, which... or pre-1990, if you want. I mean, which it has got its own characteristics, i.e., you can look at it, it's in twofold. One is the fact that, South Africa was under sanctioned, remember, was sanctioned at the time. So a lot of technologies that were brought in South Africa were grey products. A lot of companies operated here were busting sanctions. This is the pre-90 or pre-90 period that operated in this industry. And then there's the post-1994 period, basically, right? And now we are 30 years from that period. I would put that into two parts, the 94, maybe the 10, 15 years, right? And then the 15 years later. So the pre-94 period, as I'm saying, you can look at it from a multiple point of view. One, South Africa was expelled from the ITU in the 1970s, right? So the ITU, which is the International Telecoms Union, which is part of the UN, South Africa was not part of that. South Africa was readmitted in the ITU in 1994 in the Kyoto Plenipotentiary Conference, which we attended. This was a very big event. So South Africa did not participate both in the regional, like African Telecommunications Union, which then was called Pan-African Telecommunications Union. So that pre-94 period, it had multiple dimensions. One, politics of apartheid, right?
Missed opportunity, though.
Very much. But also, the fact that South Africa was far behind when it comes to technology. But interestingly, when you look at South Africa's military technology capability, South Africa was very advanced, basically, right? So also because they were looking for a small market, very much everything that was technology was addressing 3 million white people or 2.5 million white people. The rest of black people in this country had no access to technologies, which made the market to be very, very small. So while that selfishness of the apartheid system honestly really caused, South Africa, one, not to become a big market in terms of various technologies that get consumed by people, because a lot of things were not allowed, that black people can access A, B, C, D, including, for instance, some of us who started learning technology in the 70s. I remember we were at Philips. We probably were 4 or 5 of us in the whole company, basically, who were technicians or probably, maybe others being trained to ultimately become engineers. In us sitting in a bench at Philips, probably, we were at the time in the 70s, 77, 8, 79, we're probably about, I would say, 5, 6 of us, at that professional level. I mean, here in Martindale, in Johannesburg, and in Doornfontein at the headquarters of Philips. So that was slowly the beginning of training young black people into technology, basically, which was not really possible before.
And can imagine you were one of the few.
Fortunate, to be one of those people. But again, the interest, as I've said, for me was driven by the fact that, at home I had a father who basically his background, understood telephony, postal systems, and basically that's what helped me.
So being in the helm of the first democratically elected government within the communications department, did that put you under pressure, the missed opportunity of the prior years? And what were your initial priorities then?
So when I came into government, and now this is now the Mandela post-94 government, of course the priority there was one, the ratio of connectivity between black areas and white areas was like light and day. And then two, the laws that were there that needed to be changed. We had to change the Post Office Act, the Post Office Act of basically 1958, the Broadcast Act of 1976, those TBBC, those Bantu stands, we had to do away with that. The Radio Act of 1952, the Cable and Wireless Act of 1949, the SABC Act of 1936.
Sure.
So these were the laws that were governing that old system that we had to scrap and write new legislations that basically are more inclusive of everybody, that also would introduce competition, for instance, not to have monopoly model, which was there before. We introduced competition in a variety of services, what was called VANs, or value-added network services. We introduced competition there. We introduced competition in application. We allowed for new OEMs to come into the country, so the market was then opened, right? For new investors to come in, for the really dynamism into the situation. We licensed more community broadcasters. Remember, SABC was a state broadcaster. We converted SABC to become a public broadcaster, so that it can truly represent the interests of the public, not only the state. And then there was the introduction of community radio, licensing new radio stations. So really, there was a lot that happened in that first 5 to 10 years after 94, changing the past, but also preparing the future. We had something that we called Info.com 2025, which was a plan for year 2025, which we are in today.
Sure. Wow. It's so interesting that you actually created and paved that foundation of ICT policy, which is a huge topic we still discuss today.
Absolutely.
In fact, the Minister of Comms himself always talks about the importance of stabilizing ICT policy, still talking about amending some of these policies.
We need new ones, though. But I'll come back to that. We need totally...
You mean completely new ones, not necessarily the policies to amend it there and there? Because he talks a lot about amending and creating stability.
We need completely
Maybe
new...
let's talk about that.
So let me just explain. Most of these policies, if you look at the ECA Act, the Electronic Communications and Transaction Act of 2002, the Telecoms Act of 1996, or ECA Act is amended, basically.
Many of them are the process.
No, but most of these were done in the period between 1994, right, and about 2002-3. Remember, there was the establishment of the IBA Act, and then the ICASA Act that then combined, basically, which is now created ICASA, basically, the establishment of CETA. To be honest with you, 25 years later, you can't even amend these laws. You need to create new laws. Why am I saying that, right? One, if you take an example of artificial intelligence, example of data, example of applications, example of blockchain, right? Examples that are related to submarine cables, examples that are related to non-terrestrial networks, which are more satellite-based, examples related to what we call, these balloons that you fly to provide connectivity, basically.
The Web3 technology.
Yes, low altitude platforms, high altitude platforms. You cannot use the laws we wrote, right? I pioneered, I championed, right? Together with the team of industry and public sector people to write those laws we wrote, right, are moribund and old. They need to be shredded, put in a dustbin, and new laws to be written. I promise you.
Is that?
This is the work.
Is that not going to be a longer process?
No. This is a year, 18 months period to basically do this. You run consultation processes, you create new legislations, data laws. Look at some of the laws today. Data, for instance. The legislations around AI, around, the way in which you define what connectivity is. You can't define connectivity by technology, for instance, right? The modern applications, issues of cybersecurity, for instance, quantum compute, related technologies that really are changing. Remember, when you write legislation, you are writing legislation for 2050. You want the law you write today to be able to be used 2040, 2045 to 2050. Right? You can't expect the laws written in the late 90s and early 2000 to actually be practical around 2040. It's just not going to work. All right?
And so what would the benefits be of completely changing those laws? And perhaps let's touch on some of the red tape that has come about as a result.
A simple example. We wrote laws that say, if you are involved in a transaction, buying a company, right, it will take 180 days to do that. You can't do that today. All right? In the speed of transaction and decision making in the way acquisitions are done, 180 days is half a year.
Wow.
Right? You can't run an industry with those types of decision-making processes. All right? I'm just giving one example, basically. If you take definitions, the way the law at the beginning has got what we call definitions. At the end has got something called schedules, right? In the definitions, the way you define things, we talk about universal service, the way you define things, these are the definitions that we pulled out of the ITU definitions of the late 80s and the 90s. I was in the ITU in the late 80s and the early 90s. And therefore, I know what I'm saying, that I'm not criticizing anybody, but I'm talking about the work we did. I'm not talking about the work that was done by somebody else. That the work we were involved in, this is the work that needs fundamental change. It doesn't need tweaking. It doesn't need adjustments here and there.
Let's talk about how those new laws would then create a conducive environment, particularly for
investments.
Emerging technologies and companies, specializing in those kind of fields, Web3 technologies. I talked to, a lot of company leaders, and they share the same sentiments. The other day I was speaking to telecoms executives who were saying that there is still a lot of red tape. There's so much we want to do and not able to do that because of existing legislations. I talked to startups. In fact, there's the startup campaign, the Startup Act campaign. So they want their own, Startup Act to be introduced in South Africa. And they talk a lot about the barriers of the lack of this act, which would then focus on emerging technologies and startups, which are those agile new startups that playing quite a crucial role in South Africa's ICT sector, but they're not able to do so many things that they want to do.
Let me give you
red tape.
Let me give you one example. If you talk about, blockchain platforms or cryptocurrency, or for instance, what one would call digital asset class, if you want. So there's a border there between the financial services sector and our industry. It's very difficult to define that boundary. If somebody talks about a fintech business or a financial services business. I mean, these are issues that need almost to be relooked, not to be done to try and look at, backward, but to say, what type of future do we need in terms of a digital asset? How do you define a digital asset? What type of laws do we want to create South Africa as that center in the world, to attract, digital asset investors, right? I mean, I give another example. You take artists, right? I mean, people who paint or people who create art. I mean, there's digital art today, and digital art has value, right? And there are marketplaces for that digital art. Now, how can we, for instance, as a country, basically create an environment whereby we create these marketplaces for African digital art to actually be housed in South Africa? All right. We don't have a framework in our industry that provides for that environment. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
All right. I mean, I'm just picking up one classic sector or environment. So as an industry, we now have this, a polycentric model that cuts across a number of other industries. And the way you write legislation, for this polycentric model, basically, you have to take into consideration other sectors, but you have to also take into consideration the core ICT industry. With the way we wrote laws in the traditional telecoms or ECA or Electronic Communications and Transaction Act, or the way we define broadcasting, look what we are involved in today, all right? I mean, this is a podcast that goes directly into the internet. You don't need a license to do this, all right? Now, this is the future of broadcasting. The future of broadcasting is directly to the internet, all right? I mean, we were buying a television the other time in Macro. People are asking me about, a television license. Really?
Yes, you can't get one.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, those things were created by us, me, that there was a radio license, by the way, before. You had to pay a license for radio.
Wow.
We said, no, you can't do this because radio appears in your phone. You can listen to radio in your phone. You can listen to radio in your computer, in anything. How do you define what is radio? How do you define today what is television? Because you don't pay a TV license to watch TV in your phone. So these are things that honestly we can't continue to do. Yes, I mean, you need to think about new revenue models, but you cannot define basically a television license basically by just that box that is a screen, which people can use a screen in front of their computer.
I watch my TV on my phone now.
I mean, you buy a screen for your computer. You can buy, and that screen that is in front of your computer can become a television.
Exactly.
So I'm just saying to illustrate the extent of, scrapping the old, writing the new.
We are running out of time, but I'm tempted to ask you this next question. What would a new law do for South Africa in the area of artificial intelligence? We're seeing other regions across the globe introducing your AI acts, etc. Is this something that could benefit South Africa?
So there are three aspects. I mean, there's AI today globally that is almost a terrain of geopolitics, right? I mean, that is something that's happening where major powers, I mean, there's a race. Remember, there was a race of nuclear before. There was a race of space before, right? Space race. This is another race that we see today, that major powers, the debate is going to be who is going to, or what is going to, or what is AI supremacy going to look like? Who is going to be number one in the world? What are the characteristics of being number one? The fear that a lot of countries are having is the weaponization of this, right? How AI then ultimately will be used either in the military, in defense, in those things, or embedded in weapon systems that are used for war or for a variety of reasons, right? But also AI can be used for good, right? I mean, that's why there are bodies that argue that AI must be used for good. Now, the critical debate that the country needs to have is the following, right? we cannot let this global race happen and sit and fold our arms. We need to invest in research as the public sector, as the private sector. We need to build AI factories. We need to build AI infrastructure, meaning data centers, whereby we will run these new AI models, right? We need to make sure that, law enforcement can use AI in order to fight crime. We need to make sure that our defense is able to build modern, sophisticated ways of new theaters of war in understanding how the future of conflict is going to look like using AI. So it's not just a ICT or tech environment. It cuts across almost everything. In health, in education, in defense, in security of the country, in all aspects. So really, the way in which one would define it is the country cannot be left behind in this, because this is something so fundamental in the evolution of development of technologies today.
And
or generally global positioning in the competitiveness of countries.
And I presume it's also important then to provide the guidance on ethical use of these technologies, because without that, then
So the issue, what I'm saying, Sibahle, is that from 2025, as we are just concluding Q1 of this century, if you want, first quarter of the century, moving to the second quarter of the century, as a country, we really need to think strategically about where we want to be in 2050 and define that objective, and let then the legislation and the policies of the country basically be designed towards that 2050 objective of where must South Africa look like, or where should Africa look like. It is possible for us to define that 2050 vision and objective in AI, in data, in technology, in everything we do, and let both public and private sector work towards that. You then define your legislation, your policies towards that vision that you want to create. But just basically taking what exists today, which was designed in 1995, basically, right? And just tweak it. You can't. We have to have a 20, 15-year perspective in the way we look at the country. The country, we cannot purely look at it in 2, 3, 4 years. Not at all. We have to take a long-term view and invest in that long-term view, both as the public sector and as private sector. For instance, if we say we want South Africa to become a hub of submarine cables, all right? There are about 16 submarine cables that land here. And make sure that that becomes that. If we want South Africa to become a hub of data centers, right, we know very well this is what we want to do. If we want South Africa to be number one in the emerging markets in terms of AI, we know what do you do to get into that. What investments do you need? What training do you need to do? What capabilities do you build? What policies do you create? What investment-friendly conditions you create? How you then attract domestic and foreign investors towards that objective that you want to achieve.
Wow, that's so profound. How I wish we had the whole day to discuss this issue.
I know.
But let's talk now about your journey in the private sector. Of course, you're the chairman of Convergence Partners, which is a private equity firm. Let's tell us more about what inspired the establishment of this investment firm. And then later on, you then went on to establish another one, Solcon Capital.
No, Solcon is 20 years, actually. It's 22 years this year.
You were part of?
No, Solcon was established in 2003. The investments at Solcon have been there for over 20 years. Yes. So just let me go back to Convergence. So Convergence is a private equity fund. We invest across the continent. And the fund that we have today is around $300 million. And we invest in digital infrastructure, fiber in West Africa, data centers, again, in East and West Africa, tower companies. We invest in basically software companies and system integration companies across the continent. So we really have a footprint in almost more than more than 25 countries across the continent and other countries whereby the companies provide services to. I mean, so this is what we do. We are very active in ECOWAS, in Togo, in Liberia, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, coming down in DRC. We are active in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and then in Southern Africa, Malawi, and most of the SADC countries, basically. So really, for us, what is the objective? There are 1.4 billion people in Africa. I mean, the objective really is to build infrastructure that cuts across almost all regions of Africa. We have submarine cables on the Atlantic side and the Indian side. We also have fiber cutting across most of the major cities.
Let's talk about, perhaps mention some of these portfolio companies that you...
So, I mean, take as an example, ITWeb. I mean, ITWeb is in Kenya, Uganda, basically. I mean, is in DRC, is in Togo. They've got a submarine cable, part of Equiano, basically. I mean, they've got fiber in all of these countries. I mean, you take another example, Inc. I mean, Inc. is in Nigeria. Inc. is in Cote d'Ivoire. Inc. is in Cameroon, in Malawi, in Mozambique. We are in South Africa, in Botswana, Zambia, basically. Just mention
your C-Track. There's quite a list.
C-Track, then, I mean, this is the latest transaction that we are supposed to be talking about. I mean, C-Track then is in South Africa, but we've now acquired businesses in Australia, New Zealand, in Germany, in Belgium, in France, in UK, and Ireland.
So how big is your portfolio under Convergence?
So as I was saying, I mean, the portfolio is pretty large. I mean, we have 2 funds running already. I mean, more vintage fund and the fund currently running. I mean, there's probably over close to $700 million assets under management. Yes.
Sure. So let's talk about Solcon. Because there was a time when we received press releases on the rebranding of Solcon.
Solcon is a permanent capital. So remember I said, Convergence Partners is a private equity fund, yes, right, and which we invest across the continent. Solcon Capital as a permanent capital vehicle, permanent capital investment firm. I mean, companies there, we invested at Dimension Data before, we invested at SICOM, a company called Inala, and many others. So there's a portfolio of companies under that brand, basically. And as I've said, there are a portfolio of companies under SICOM. I mean, and Solcon basically is deep tech, basically around issues that are related to more Web3 type technologies. I mean, we have a platform in Southeast Asia, in Bangalore, focusing in that part of the world. So that's what basically Solcon focuses on.
And let's talk about your latest investment in C-Track.
C-Track, yes.
What is the vision around
So C-Track basically is traditionally a telematics business. I mean, in better for simplicity, tracking, of vehicles. But today, we don't just do that. We now provide more what we call observability in cars, in fleets, in a sense. So if you have a fleet of cars that carry vegetables from farms from Limpopo to Gauteng, or that carry, for instance, minerals from DRC to the port of Maputo, or the port of Durban, or whatever port that goes to, Asia, etc. We track that truck from Lubumbashi to the port, right? Or let's say you have trucks that carry minerals from Western Australia to smelters, for instance, in Brisbane or in Sydney. Basically, we track that truck from the mines in Western Australia right up to where the smelters are located. If, for an example, you have a payload or trucks moving out of Rotterdam in Netherlands, almost carrying fresh flowers that are going to either Belgium or France, or basically, or maybe from there to Hague, from Rotterdam to Hague as an example, right? We can see that track and the temperature, for instance, and the tire pressure.
And the monitoring technology.
Wow. Etc. So that is really what's... So CTRAC has a repository of data and running AI solutions for the automotive industry, in particular fleets, basically, that or commercial vehicles, if you want. So that's really what their focus is in all of these countries, in Europe, Australasia, basically, and parts of Africa and Middle East.
And so what was your interest with CTRAC? Do you see
it's all data.
Bright future
of course,
in that industry?
Right. Yeah.
And what do you foresee, or what are the plans?
Remember, just to give an example, I mean, take the valuation of Tesla versus the rest of the automotive other industries. The value in the automotive industry is based on the data, what is called kilometers of data that, I mean, a car or a truck or a vehicle would have. So what is very important in the automotive industry is the data that vehicles collect, is the data on the road, what is called street furniture, the ability to collect data of the location and everything that's happening around. Remember, we're moving into semi-driverless and driverless ultimately. For us to be able to get to that level, it is the ability for the data that we collect on the road and the analytics that we run for you to be able to sit comfortably like this behind and let the car make decisions rather than you. Wow. There will be less accidents on the road if we do that than giving the power to individuals. Because remember, your car, I mean, an AI node in a car is not going to be tested for drinking and driving.
Yeah, that's why they say data is the new gold. Or do they say it's the new oil now?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about, when I look at last year, or maybe let's say the last 2 years, Convergence has really been on a shopping spree, for lack of a better definition, buying so many companies. What does the future hold for this year? And I know you can't divulge much. What can you tell us? Perhaps tell us about the industries that you're interested in.
Look, I mean, for us, I mean, remember, we are a digital infrastructure fund. I mean, so digital infrastructure is at the core of what we do, right? I mean, for us, building that digital infrastructure or investing in digital infrastructure in Africa is really what our game is all about. And we believe that that is the foundation to build that future of 2050 I was talking about, right? You have to lay that foundation of optic fiber on land, in the ocean, build towers, basically, build satellite networks, constellations. I mean, this is what we need to do if we want this future that is the quantum future that we want, right? You have to start with that digital infrastructure. So, I mean, Convergence Partners is now investing in digital infrastructure. And therefore, really for us, this is the laying this foundation. But of course, we do look at other opportunities that come. And Africa, as I've said, is our forte, is our area, basically of focus. I mean, watch this space. There's a couple of interesting things that we see in the continent. So for us, we believe that 1.4, very soon, by 2040, we will have 2 billion people in the continent. 2 billion people. Think about 2 billion mobile phones that need to connect those people, right?
Oh, yes.
And think about the infrastructure that is needed for that. Think about the data centers, the edge data centers, the amount of data that will be generated in the African continent with a population that is the youngest in the world. So the opportunities in this continent is huge. It's huge. That is why you see everybody in the world, all hyperscalers, everybody's coming this way, all right? Because of the amount of time, you and me have no much time to spend, and yet younger people, the hours they spend in the digital ecosystem is way more than everybody. Now, Africa is going to lead. When I say this, people, Africa by 2050 will be leading the world in the digital ecosystem.
Well, there really is a battle for the endless opportunities
Absolutely.
on this continent.
Yes.
Let's talk about Solcon Capital.
Yes.
What does the future hold? I know that you spoke a lot about Solcon's interest in satellite technologies. What does the future hold for 2025?
So we built, remember we built and launched a satellite about 2011, 2012, right? I mean, there's a new constellation model of small and micro satellites, right, that we are busy looking at today. I mean, and Africa as a landmass, it does require its own constellation, to be honest with you.
Is this satellite for connectivity or other function?
For all applications, yeah, for connectivity, for location-based services, I mean, for remote sensing, and also generally for a number of different applications. I mean, today, there are all these new types of smaller satellites that are built. I mean, that you can, I mean, they're not that expensive as the older geolocated based satellites. So this is one area we're looking at. Of course, we look at a number of deep software capability, for a number of these modern systems that are built for a variety of types of industries.
So in closing, our editor Admire said, I need to ask you this. We love hearing about your Silicon Valley experience.
So I'm going tomorrow.
But yes, do you want to share a bit about your trip that's coming up?
And not much.
Yet. Okay.
Yeah, but just to basically say that the world has a number of centers of development. I mean, one is the Bay Area will remain that. And then also places like India, for instance, in Bangalore. I mean, again, if you take, there's now, you can't run away from the fact that, Shenzhen and Shanghai are some of the major centers of technology, while on the other side, Taiwan is still the bulwark of, semiconductor in the world, right? So, the way the planet is today, it has got all of these centers. I mean, as technologists, you have to have presence in all of them if you really want to be part and parcel of the future. Basically, you have to have presence in the software centers of the world, the Bangalores of the world. You have to have basically access to chipsets that are coming, that are going to drive the future of AI, which some of them come from, Taiwan, some of them come from China, basically, some of them come from the US, the NVIDIA, the AMDs, and all of these new type technologies that are coming. So really, the planet is becoming very, very small. The tech planet is becoming very small, and the ability to have access to these nodes and know what is happening and be able to have presence in them. This is what really drives the future of a tech investor or a tech entrepreneur today.
Wow. So I don't know if we still do have time for my last question. Speaking of Silicon Valley, we've heard government talk a lot about how they're trying to position South Africa as the Silicon Valley of Africa. How, in your opinion, how can South Africa also create and become its own Silicon Valley?
Silicon Valley is a state of mind. It's not buildings. It's not anything else. It's a state of mind of the people.
Wow.
It's the spirit of entrepreneurial that runs 24/7, right? People who 7 days a week, basically, they live, they breathe this environment. So and for us, we can do that. How do we do that? Is by basically creating that entrepreneurial culture amongst young people in our society, by supporting startups, by supporting, incubators, accelerators, not just in Gauteng or Western Cape, in other parts of the country, right? If we do this consistently, not do it, and make people appreciate apprenticeship in technology, to become artisans, to become technicians, and move up the ranks to ultimately become engineers. You can't start here, basically. We have to make people understand laying fiber cable, right, for an internet company, getting into ceilings, running fiber, or building networks in the streets, or starting Java, learning how Java works, learning how Python works, learning how Ruby works, learning how R works, right? All of these languages, all of these software platforms, this is where it starts. And Anyone, any young person can do that. It doesn't matter. You can come from the deep rural of South Africa. You can succeed in tech. It has got no color. It has no gender. It's something that requires one thing only, one passion.
Wow. So creating a Silicon Valley starts
That's
with the mind.
It's in the mindset. And we need to encourage young people to have a passion for this, because this is what the future is. And if we can be able to build that passion in them and make tech a lifestyle and not a job, so that they live it, it becomes a hobby, it becomes something that they've got social clubs of tech, it becomes something like, playing games with it. That's what really this thing is all about. If we do that to this next generation, because they live online nevertheless, but to try and shift them just from being consumers of TikTok to builders of future TikTok platforms.
Wow. So we need to inspire our youth.
That's all what we need. We need to inspire them, but for that inspiration to sit, but also we need to build that passion in them. I truly believe that in life, if you have a passion on anything, the rest will happen. What we need in the next generation to build that 2050 I talked about is to create young South Africans who really are passionate about tech.
Wow, definitely keeping a mental note of that. Don't just be a consumer of TikTok and Instagram, but be a content creator, and even beyond that, be a platform developer of the solution.
Build your own TikTok.
Build your own TikTok. There you go. Thank you so much, Mr. Ngcaba. That was Andile Ngcaba, the Executive Chairman and founding partner of Convergence Partners, as well as the founder of Solcon Capital. And of course, he serves on the investment committee of funds under management, and that's a string of those funds. And it has been a fantastic and insightful hour. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Well, there you have it. Hope you enjoyed that discussion as much as I did. And remember to subscribe, like, and share this video. Adios.